So this is the first plenary, and it's covering the overview, structure, and principles of the SS. You have yet to get a copy of the SS. The QR code is here. So this is the agenda for this 30 minutes. This is a very short introduction to the SS, a bit of the background, and then we go into how to read, interpret. The subsequent workshops will go into detail for each of the activity contexts. So before the development of the standard, there was an environmental scan about the OE in Singapore in terms of the demand and the supply. And at the point of time, it was really coming out of COVID. And we continue to believe that OE is important in the development of youth. So some of the things that revealed through the environmental scan was, and I think Delane alluded to it during the panel, that risk management practices were inconsistent. There was also inconsistent training and adoption of standards by instructors and educators. And while we had NSAs who were involved in the proficiency training for many of the educators, there was also some gaps. For example, improvised rafting was really in virgin territory, and challenge ropes courses, we didn't have a local reference. Many of us took reference from overseas. But because of different kinds of references, there were inconsistencies. So in general, there was a need to get to a common code so that we can manage expectations, and so both internally and externally. At the time, the council came together in 2022, and if you look at the terms of reference, number 3 is very clearly about setting those standards, and number 1 about capacity building and professional development for the sector, which will be covered in plenary number 2. At the start, a work group was formed. There were many invitations sent out, and these brave souls stood up to be counted, to give their time, because right from the onset we told them this is a 2-year commitment, and once you're in, you're in. And because this is a very small community, we know who you are. You know, and if you don't commit and sustain, then you will affect some friendships, I think. Okay, but just to briefly look at this, is that the composition was very intentional. It gives a good spread between the public, the private organizations, as well as the people side and the academic institutions, so that it's as comprehensive as we can get based on those who are willing to commit. So the code of practice, this SS, is really the result of this group's work, as well as the supporting crew from Enterprise SG and the technical writers. In terms of the process, our first work group meeting started in 2023, January 18. That was our first official work group meeting. Every work group meeting is documented, minuted by Enterprise SG people, so that objectivity and transparency is maintained. Voting on decisions is made and is recorded in minutes so that it's official. The final meeting was in April 2024. That was the 18th official work group meeting. Each of the work group meeting was at least 5 hours. And on top of these official meetings, there were subgroup meetings, conveners meetings that added on another 15 to 20 rounds. We completed the draft in May 2024, and then we submitted to Enterprise Singapore through their various levels of approvals, because they will quality control the writing of the standard. They gave comments, we answered them, and then in June last year, we put it out for 3-month public consultation. Information was sent about this. It was published publicly, and we received quite a lot of comments. So once we finished the consultation, we took in and we responded to every single comment. Every single person who submitted a comment was responded to. It wasn't like I take it and then thank you very much. We consider it. No, every comment, whether it was accepted or not accepted, it was responded to. And then finally, it was approved in October. And then the editorial process, polishing, proofwriting, it's a long document, lots of words. We need to make it as readable and consistent in terms of the language as possible. And then actually it was published in December last year without official. And only after that we had time to start planning for today. Okay, so that's why it's somewhat delay. From the outset, the objectives were very clear, that we want to design and deliver safe and educational experiences. So this differentiates standards related to sports. It differentiates us from standards relating to high performance or recreation. This is from the educational angle. And it creates a framework of guidelines and best practices for us when we are designing these programs. And we reference the most common OE activity types for this code. We know that there are many, and it's always evolving, but we cannot keep going and going. So we took the 12 or 13 most commonly used across the sector to start with. And if we achieve this, then we will be one step towards the safety and quality that we aspire to. So these are what the standard covers. It talks about who is accountable for doing these things. It talks about as a activity leader or as a program supervisor, or if you are an assistant activity leader, what is the level of responsibility you can and you should have, and what is the level of training or ability that you have and should have. And A and B is actually very closely tied. There's accountability for these two parties. Delane spoke earlier about a risk management system that will be recommended. And beyond that, it's also about locations and facilities and equipment that they are the right ones and they are in good condition to be used. And finally, it's really about information. Information that needs to be prepared and communicated to the customer. Sometimes it's the parent, sometimes it's the school, frequently it's both. And between a provider and the people working the program. So the kinds of communication. So the emphasis or the application is really for educational and training purposes. Companies that are providing training for outdoor education may also take reference from this guideline, whether the programs are paid or unpaid. So if you organize an OE program and you ask your friends to bring their kids and participate, that can also be considered an OE program that is subject to these guidelines. Because risks are still real, whether they are paying for it or not. So that's the kind of the ethics and approach we want to take and use this. And what the standard is not applicable to: recreation and therapy. At this point, we have not enough expertise to incorporate these two areas, specifically for therapy. So it's not included. Although there are some clauses in there that relate to managing vulnerable participants, and there's a definition in there of what vulnerable participants are. We also exclude children's playgrounds and those sites that are designed for unsupervised use. Those are commonly regulated by other standards or even the law. So we don't need to look into those areas. As I mentioned earlier, these are the common activities that we took reference from. If you look at that, you may offer some of those, you may outsource some of those, you may have most of them for some of the companies here.
Right. So a lot of question one of the common question that you guys have asked is, there are other standards. Why do we want to create our own standard instead of doing a direct adoption of the existing standards? So I think in the earlier forum, I did share that there are companies that have came to us to say that you are using ABC standards from ABC country, and are you able to continue to use all these standards? Now, my short answer to you is, whatever that you have been doing in your organization, most of the sound and sensible things that you do in the organization are already in the Singapore standards. All right, and why are we not directly adopting the standards from other country? There are a few reasons. Why? One is the context of the spaces may be different. Even for weather condition. Singapore, you probably have 4 seasons. You got the hottest. So we only got 1 season. Compared to other countries, you have your summer, you have your winter, you have your snowing. So context-wise, weather conditions are also different. All right, and rules and regulation, the laws, the legislations are also different. All right. In Singapore, when we craft the Singapore standard, we are also crafting in line with what is the prevailing laws and regulation, whether is it MPARKS, MPA, or even we take guidance from the guidelines from MOE and from the early childhood. So all this is information that we use in crafting this standard. So if you look at this overview of the SS7102024, the first item here is basically talking about document control. All right, and when you look at the document control, if you have a copy of the standard, the forward of the standard will give you an overview of the objective and the intention of these standards. And like what Evan had mentioned, things that we are covering that is outdoor adventure, education related. So anything to do with recreation and high performance, we always emphasize this because a lot of times you will come back to us to say that, no, the NSA has this standard, should we follow, should we not follow? Now, my short answer to you is, when we craft this standard, the national sports associations are also consulted and are also involved. And what you have seen in the standard is a comprehensive consultation with all these parties so that we come to certain alignment of what is relevant and what is critical for our current context. And in this case, it's outdoor adventure education. All right. So the document control will look at the normative references as well as the definition of terms. So in this standard, the roles of who is responsible for what is also indicated clearly in the standard. Whether you are the provider or whether you are the activity leadership. Now, these two terms will keep appearing on your standards. So when you talk about the provider, means you are the private operators, these are things that you need to do. When I talk about activity leadership, will be whoever that is in charge of the activity or whoever that is the executive in charge of that particular scope that they are responsible for. All right, so these are two keywords that you will see in the standards. Then moving on, there's this thing called core requirement. Now, core requirements are written in clause 4. So like I say, clause 4 is the most important clause. Okay, like everything is important, but you must read clause 4 before reading the rest of the chapter. So what do I mean? Clause 4, if you don't read clause 4 and you proceed on to clause 5, 6, 7, or 8, the standards will not make sense to you. All right? But once you reach clause 4 and you skip clause 5 because you're not doing clause 5 and you're doing clause 6, it will make sense. So clause 4 is an important module. Like your O-levels, English is the compulsory one. This one is the compulsory. Mandated clause 4. All right? And then the rest of the chapter will be based on what activities you will be doing. So the core requirement is a requirement for all activities. And then when it comes down to your activity category, So we have classified it into 3 key components. 1, water-based activity, land-based activity, and height-based activity. So if you are only doing water-based, you just focus on water-based. But of course, if you're only doing water-based and you're only doing improvised rafting, then focus on the introduction of the water-based standards and then go straight to your improvised raft building. So there are so this is where the workshops that you'll be attending will help you to make sense of what are the important clauses that you need to know. So in each of these main water-based, land-based, and height-based, there will always be an introduction that you need to read. So you must read the introduction, and part of the introduction will also tell you that you are required to refer to Clause 4. So you must be familiar with Clause 4 before reading on to your respective disciplines. So I call these disciplines, all right, the individual activities. So under water-based, we are covering improvised raft building, kayaking, rowboating, stand-up paddling, and dragger boating. Now, the reason why we have chosen all these activities is based on the survey that we conduct with all the private operators, and these are the commonly used activity in any outdoor education programs. At the start, we actually included sailing. Then we realized that, when we check with all the private operators out there, not many of you are doing sailing, all right? And if you are doing sailing, then our suggestion is you can still read the standard, but you must still go back to your National Sports Association Federation, which is the current available standards for sailing. All right. So activities are not in scope. It doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. You must still go back to whatever that is available in the market. All right. Now, earlier on in the panel, Co-Chair David spoke about adoption. All right. In the next 1 or 2 years, we are giving time for private operators to adopt the standard. What does that mean? It means that giving you time to do a health check on what are the areas that you need to work on, and whether it will eventually have an accreditation process or whether there's a validation process, that will be the next discussion at the OE Council level. But as of now, the adoption process is important. Now, even in this adoption process, in the event when there is an incident, or touch wood, if there is a fatal injury or a fatal accident, the court of law will always go back to what is available in the market. And in this case, it's the Singapore standard. So the court will therefore use the Singapore standard as a reference point to make certain decision or ask certain question. So while it is voluntary adoption, while we say, okay, since it's a voluntary adoption, I decided not to use it at all, I do my own SOP, you can. But in the event when the accident takes place, the court of law will still refer back as the Singapore standard as the reference point. At the same time, your insurance company will also take it as a reference point because that is the national standard. So as early adopters, this is where you take the next 1 or 2 years to prepare yourself of how you level up the safety and the well-being of the students in any of the program. At the same time, like what Ling has also shared, that if you look at these standards, there will be some areas that you may need to beef up. There may be some areas that are missing that you need to put in some resources. And that's why later on in the afternoon, we are talking about professional development. These are areas of work that requires you to put in resources, manpower, and to upskill your manpower to ensure that you are able to interpret the standard. First, you must learn how to interpret. Second is to implement the standard. And third is to be able to review your process. All right. So this is basically the overview of this SS 7102024. All right. Now, so this is how the chapter 4, which is the most compulsory chapter, looks like. All right. So chapter 4 is the core planning principles. The core planning principle comprises of 1 to 9. Looks like a lot, but is not so threatening. So don't worry. Now, later on in the breakup session, in the first breakup session, there are 2 sessions. There are two topics. One is on risk assessment management and emergency action plan, and the other segment is on program design. All right. So under the core planning principle, chapter or clause number 4 of subchapter 9 is basically talking about learning, design, and facilitation. So basically, if I remove 9 and it's 1 to 8, it's basically a technical reference. And the reason why we put in a 9 is because it's outdoor adventure education. And therefore, what makes it unique from the recreation or the high performance is that there is an education. So the education component, there are certain statements and guidelines that you need to follow. For example, that you have a learning framework, and how do you measure your learning framework, all right? Then under the core planning, which most of you should be okay, because this is what you have been doing. How you plan your program, how you do your learning needs analysis, design a program, which most of you will be expert. How do you do the activity planning? What activities goes into what to reach certain learning outcome? That would be 2. Third big piece is the risk assessment management plan, or the risk management plan. Now, the risk management plan, we set certain shall statement, but the shall statement has a word like, no, the provider shall have a risk assessment management plan that comprises of this. How you do this, we are not going to detect. All right? But you must make sure that how you do it addresses the key requirement of a risk assessment plan. Of course, there will be models like 5x5 matrix or the 10x10 matrix, which later on in the concurrent sessions, Jishan and Rizwan, who's in charge of this, will share with you some of the best practices which we can use to address your requirement of Chapter 4, 4.4. All right? Then we talk about participants. You know, how you brief the participant, expectation of the participants. We also talk a little bit about the ratio, your site of supervision. So all this will be part of 4.5. All right. Then 4.6 is talking about environment. All right, the weather, your environment, your locations. 7, talking about how you maintain your equipment, how to make sure your equipment or your resources are serviceable. All right. And then 8 is on leadership and professional competency. That means what is required for a kayaking orientation instructor. What is required for a challenge course instructor. All right. So all this will be part under leadership and professional competency. Now, earlier on, Evan showed you a slide, there's a document control. Now, how do we assess that you have it? All right? Or how do you assess as a health check that you have it? First, you must be able to have documentation to show that you have these processes in place, minimally. All right? Now, when you're able to articulate your processes in a document, it means that you will have the opportunity to implement your actions written in that document. Does it make sense? So that document is important. Whether there's an assessment or not, or accreditation or not, this time is for you to prepare your document, use this document, and take action of the document of the things that you have written in that piece of document. So it's all about document. Now next. Water-based, land-based, height-based. These are the disciplines and the activity. Same thing. You can see from here, once you understand the core planning principles, when you read the chapter, whether it's challenge course, camping, or dragon boating, these are the things that you will have to cover. All right? How do you do your activity planning for kayaking? How do you do your risk assessment for kayaking? What is the emergency action plan when you're conducting kayaking? Who are the participants? The different participants, different demographic may require different skill sets. So you may be dealing with special needs, you may be dealing with younger children or vulnerable individuals. So these are things that are addressed in this standard. All right. And then what are the equipment that you'll be using? So let's take, for instance, raft building. All right. Raft building, we will tell you that these are things that you need to do. What are the equipments that you may need? Sometimes we may not say like you shall build your raft using barriers. All right. We won't say that. All right, we will make a statement, and then there will be some options that you can use. That this material can be so and so, or may be so and so. So the can and may will be something that will be optional. Later on, I will explain in the next slide. All right, next.
Just to add one point, that if there is a new activity that is not covered here, the core principles, the core planning principles in Clause 4 is still useful because that applies generally across all activities. So if there's a new activity, use Clause 4 to help you.
Okay, so how do you read and interpret the SS? So like what Evan had mentioned, there's a consultation process, and we have already got about 200 212 comments collected during the public consultation. Now, for those of you who have submitted and you are one of the 212, now thank you so much because your inputs are important. Now, then you will say that, no, we also responded to your comments, whether can be implemented or cannot be implemented. Now, some of the comments made are very good. All right, that means they are one of the best ideas. But when we come back, why we have rejected it is because we also have to think about the smaller operators or the budding entrepreneurs who are going to outdoor adventure learning activity, whether is it practical for them to set such a high standard. All right, so out of 212 standard, there are 46 comments and amendments were accepted by the work group. 152 comments were rejected, mostly due to misinterpretation and reading out of context of the narrow perspective. Now, what do I mean? It means that out of 152, I can safely say more than 60-70% of these 152 comments did not read clause 4. Because you may be responsible, your bosses may say, hey, you read water, you read height, you read land. But a lot of them forget to read chapter 4. So end up a lot of questions that has been asked and commented were answers that are in chapter 4. So like I say, please read chapter 4 before proceeding on to the rest of the chapter. All right? Now, then 14 of the comments require no action because could be an opinion or it could be giving you a problem but there's no solution. All right? Yeah. So like I say, clause 4 is key. If you cannot remember anything that we say today, just read clause 4. All right? Now, yeah, so when you look at the various, like for example, challenge clause, there will be an introduction that says general, that says that this clause provide recommendation requirement specific to the challenge clause activity or kayaking. They are to be used in conjunction with the recommendation requirement of clause 4. So just remember clause 4. All right, next. Now, sub-clauses should be read in totality. So you don't take the whole document and say, hey, I think this one I like, I take this one, I implement. All right? Or you say that, hey, this one doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because you may not read the guides that are before that. So read the whole chapter in totality. Or at least the challenge clause, you read the challenge clause in totality.
So this is an example where if you look at this particular sub-clause in environment, it could be a full page. So you need to read the entire page to understand. Because if you look at this example in A, the first ABC, it talks about operating environment, immediate surrounding environment, and wider environment. And then the subsequent statements actually elaborate on each of these 3 points. So if you just pull out the last paragraph and say the wider environment, that's not enough. Okay, so just to give you an example of what we mean by reading in totality. And the fourth one is really, we don't need to put in clauses in there relating to regulator laws that are already in our country. It's already taken that if it's a law, you have to comply. So we don't have to write it in there.
Okay, so how then continue on? Take note of the key definition and roles. So like I say, there is like what is activity versus program. What is activity provider and program provider? Because some of us, we outsource our program. Like for example, you run a 3-day 2-night camp, you may be working with company A to provide Dragon Boat programs. So this will be your activity provider. All right? Your program provider is probably you as an operator designing the program and executing the program. So there are different roles that each of the stakeholders will play when you are conducting an outdoor adventure learning activities. Then we have what we call a program supervisor. Now there's definition of program supervisor. Some of you may define the program supervisor as the camp chief. Some of you may think that the program supervisor may be the person that is overall in charge of your unit. So that really depends on how we are not going to decide or we're not going to tell you how you run your company because you know how to run your own organization. But based on the definition of a program supervisor, decide your own hierarchy, who is the program supervisors. All right? Then we have what we call an activity supervisor, which is in charge of the activities. So, like challenge course, EFI, or it can be the challenge course conductor. So there is a activity leadership. The responsible person, the definition of responsible person is also written on the standard. Non-participating contact, vulnerable participant, and what is the supervision type. You on this chart on this diagram, figure 1 on OE programming planning overview. What you need minimally in the organization is that you have a OE program plan. And part of your OE program plan, you must be able in your document citing that you must be able to help me make sense or help your client to make sense on your risk management, your emergency management, your participant, your environment, your equipment, your leadership, proficiency, and your learning design. Same thing when it comes to activity plan. All right? So your activity plan could be, when you design your program, in your program you may have 3 or 4 activities, and each of these activities should or shall have this component. All right? Then when it comes to the supervision hierarchy, you all know that for those of you who are in safety, you know there's something called direct, indirect, remote. Again, the standards will also explain to you what each of these supervision means, and based on your activity, whether you are doing direct, indirect, or remote supervision. So let's say, for example, in a case of improvised route building, some of you do your improvised route building outside. That means in the open sea, in the open waters, all right? Then the question is whether you are doing direct, indirect, or remote. Some of you may do your route building in the swimming pool, very controlled environment, or within sight. Are you applying direct, indirect, or remote? Again, the operating procedure of how you do it may not be so straightforward in the standard, because it's going back to first the competency of the instructor, and also the environment, and also the type of students that you are dealing with. So if you are dealing with kids that with special needs, obviously you need a lot more direct supervision. But if you are dealing with more mature kids or experienced kids, then perhaps that type of activity may require indirect or remote supervision. All right, so that is something that you will need to make a bit of sound judgment call on your programs. All right, now next. So who has accountability for what action? Like I said earlier on, there's 2 things that you need to know. One is the provider. The provider will be the private operators. All right? So the provider, like for example, it says 413, the provider shall keep all program plans including associated activity plans to a minimum period of 3 years. Means it is the private operator responsibility, mandated responsibility, to make sure that you have your plans to be kept for 3 years. All right? So this is the provider. So the type of action, we need to identify what is the key verb and words used in the clause statement. Remember I tell you the mantra of the standard is shall, should, may, can. Now, what is shall? When they say the provider shall do this, it means that it's mandated, it's compulsory, you must have it. You cannot compromise. All right? What is a should statement? Should statement means it's a recommendation. So it could say that, the provider should implement a 1:1 ratio. For example, just 1:1 ratio. Should you do it? No, you don't have to do it. It's a recommendation. But if they say that the provider should provide a ratio of 1:20, you must make sure that minimally it's 1:20. Can it be 1:19? You can. Can it be 1:21? You can't. All right? So you must know what is a shall statement. The should is a recommendation. The may indicates a permission. All right? This may include the following. Then you can choose to take all, or you can choose to take 1 or 2. Can is basically a possibility. So there are 4 verbs that you need to know. Shall, should, may, can. The whole document will not have all shall statements. Right? So not to worry. The shall statements are statements that we think that is important for you to have in your policies. Okay, so let's say, for example, in 4.8.9, it says management of the activity shall include, but not limited to. The word not limited to is basically required, but not at exhaustive list. Meaning, shall include, but not limited to A, B, C, D. A, B, C, D, you must have. You want to add E, F, G, it's up to you. Should include, are not limited to. Basically, imagine I change this statement, management of activity, but the activity should include, but it's not limited to. What does that mean? It means that it's recommended to have it, But if you don't have it, it's not mandated. Does it make sense? Okay? It's not like English lesson, huh? Yeah. So there's this in your document, in the last few pages, there will be these references called the normative references and informative references. Now, normative references are references that is required, meaning these are known standards. So there will be cases like, for example, climbing, when you are building climbing or the facilities, they may say that your climbing facility must be according to EN whatever ABCD standards. And this will be written as a normative standards that you need to refer to. What does that mean to us? It means that when you read this standard, all right, and this standard studies say that there's an EN 1234, means that you also need to have the EN 1234 to comply to whatever that's written in this standard. Okay? Now, then the informative standard are what we call recommended information and things that you need to know. Now, adopting and conforming to SS 710, like what co-chair has shared earlier on, we are going on the process of adoption. Earlier on, I also say that what is the implication? The implication is, as of today, when the standard is launched, any incident, any accident, we will still base back on whether the provider follow the standard in the market. So this is now the standard of the sector. Okay? Now, adoption process right now is probably about 1 or 2 years. The council is going to deliberate whether would there be a possibility for us to look at some validation process. Now, why are we looking at validation? All right, we are looking at the possibility of validation process or the accreditation process is because this is a standard, and sometimes whether is it the procurement agency like MOE or schools may use this as a procurement lever. All right, and when they use this as a procurement lever, there must be a way to measure. Imagine 100 companies, and 100 companies just say that, hey, I actually follow. All right. I mean, everybody will follow. But once we have a validation process or accreditation process, this is where there will be an external vendor coming in to look at the processes that you have, that you put in place, and the evidence that you have put in place to ensure you meet the standard. All right. That is why at the start we talk about documentation. Your documentation are evidence to help the potential assessor in the future to make sense of your operating process and procedure in running an OAE program. All right? Ken? Evan, anything else? So, any other question? So I thought that I wanted to, before I pass the time back to Evan, I thought that I wanted to end off this with a testimonial that is given by this guy from the international sector. All right. For those of you who know Jeff, you know Jeff? Jeff from Barista. All right. So for those of you who attended the course on safety, when we gave him the standard for his review, and this is what he has to say. He says that we applaud Singapore for being the first in ASEAN to develop and launch a national standard for outdoor adventure education. This is a significant milestone that raises the bar for safety, professionalism, and education value in the sector. By taking the lead, Singapore is not only enhancing its own ecosystem, but also setting a strong example for other countries in the region to strengthen and align practices. We hope that this paves the way for wider adoption of such standard in the region. So there are people out there that are reading our standards. And by reading our standards, they already can recognize that the effort that we put in, at the same time, looking at the standard as something that is not just locally recognized, but also recognized at the regional level. Now, I'm going to address one question that you may have. What happens if you do your programs overseas? All right, for those of you who are doing travel, if you are abseiling overseas or kayaking overseas, do I follow the standard? All right, now, when you go to other country, there are rules and regulations from other country. But your standard will give you some knowledge of questions that you should ask the provider that is in that country. This standard do not cover overseas activities that are conducted overseas. These are activities that are conducted locally. All right, but with your knowledge and the knowledge and the information you have in the standard, it helps you to ask the right question, to ask the right documentation from your provider. But your provider is from the overseas company are not obliged to give to you. Right? So I thought that I want to state this clause clearly to the private operators. Thank you.
I'm sure you have some questions. That's where the workshops later will give you time to go into your questions in greater depth. But I hope this provides overview so that you're ready when you go into the workshops how to read the clauses and maybe address some of your existing questions already. So I'm mindful.
Any
Burning question related to what we've covered.
Don't worry, the workshop providers should be ready to answer all kinds of questions.
Yes, Alfred.
So
Quick question because we are running on time. Yeah.
Okay, so on the use of the word recreational, right? I know there's sports and all that, they complicate things. Now, when I receive my kayaking certification, it's for recreational kayaking. Yeah. What we are teaching our students is actually recreational kayaking. So does that in any way conflict what you have stated in the standards? Thanks.
Okay, so for example, I mean, if I read your question correctly, for example, if your kids are going for one-star kayaking program, all right, actually that is considered a pursuit, all right. That is a skill set that's learned. So when it comes to one-star program or whether you are doing climbing level 1, level 2, you go back to your National Sports Association. Your NSA would have the guideline that you need to run this program. But if you are looking at a kayaking orientation program in school, all right, then if it's educational and there is a learning outcome behind and there is a structure for learning, then you have to refer back to the OE standards. All right? But like I say, if you are not sure, that means, hey, I don't know whether this one is it considered or not, then let me tell you, just call MOE. MOE will advise you.
So that's a great question because there's actually SS 701, which is the inland and open water sports safety. That covers recreational as well as performance kayaking and water sports. But when it comes to the program that is for educational purpose, then SS 710 is the right one.
Whenever in doubt, if you are education institution, whether you are in doubt, go back to MOE, right? Private operators,
specifically Celine. She's also in the working group, so she understands both sides.
But if you are a private operator, not sure how to interpret, or you are concerned about some of the procurement requirement, then if you are, like I say, if you are part of our members, we will address it and we will still go back to MOE. So if your client, majority of it is MOE, then it is better for them to be able to advise whether your kind of activity is considered OAE or whether is it considered recreation or pursuit. All right?
Okay.
Can I explain? Yeah.
Yes. So please, thank you for your presence here and make your way to the workshops immediately. We start at 11:40.